Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel at 1:12 in the morning. My son called from an unknown number, barely breathing enough to tell me that if he fought back, nobody would ever believe him. Inside the precinct, no officer met my eyes. The narrative was already set by his accuser, the beloved town sweetheart. But I work in compliance. I do not need to scream. I only need to find one tiny flaw in her perfect lie to bring it all down. My name is Isser Thomas. I am 42 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life mitigating disasters before they happen, living in Cedar Hollow, North Carolina, a town where everyone knows everyone else, but nobody really knows anyone at all. You learn to keep your head down and mind your own business. I work as a records compliance manager for Larkspur Fleet Services. My daily life revolves around auditing driver logs, maintaining rigid safety protocols, cross-referencing timestamps, and finding the exact point where a story stops making sense. I look for the missing piece of data. I find the lie. For years since my divorce, it has just been me and my son, Rowan Thomas. He recently turned 18, a milestone we celebrated with a quiet dinner and a profound sense of shared survival. He is a thoughtful boy, prone to quiet observation rather than loud outbursts, carrying a heavy conscience that makes him older than his years. That was why the phone call at 1:12 in the morning felt like a physical blow to my chest. I woke up to the harsh, relentless vibration of my phone against the wooden nightstand. When I answered, the voice on the other end was thin, trembling, and struggling to pull in enough oxygen to form words. It was Rowan. He was calling from the local police station. He told me he had been arrested. The words tumbled out of him in a chaotic, desperate rush, completely devoid of his usual calm and measured demeanor. He had been accused of shoving and threatening his stepmother after a heated argument. Vanessa Vale Mercer. I threw off the covers and dressed in the dark, my mind instantly racing through the gears of crisis management. Tonight was supposed to be a standard court-mandated weekend dinner at his father's house. Dean Mercer, my ex-husband, had rebuilt his life with a woman who had quickly become the gleaming centerpiece of Cedar Hollow society. Vanessa was the woman who organized the charity bake sales, who spoke with a measured, pious tone at community board meetings, and who always remembered the names and the troubles of the cashiers at the local grocery store. She had successfully weaponized kindness, turning it into a shimmering shield that made her absolutely bulletproof in this town. As I drove through the empty, pitch-black streets of Cedar Hollow, the heater in my car blasting against the bitter chill of the early morning, I began to piece together the warning signs I had carelessly ignored. For the past few months, Rowan had been actively finding excuses to avoid his visits to Dean's house. He would claim he had too much homework, or he was feeling sick, or he had picked up an extra shift. Whenever I pressed him about the real reason, his gaze would drop to the floor, and he would offer the same evasive answer. He would say he just did not want to make things more complicated. He would say he did not want to cause any extra trouble for anyone. I had chalked it up to typical teenage friction, assuming he was just tired of navigating the awkward, strained dynamic of a blended family. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my joints itched. I should have pushed harder. I should have asked better questions. My son was drowning in plain sight, and I had handed him a life vest made of assumptions. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the police precinct, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the sterile waiting area. I approached the front desk, stating my name and my purpose with a voice devoid of any tremor. The shift officers were not openly hostile to me. If they had been angry, I could have fought back, but it was much worse than that. They were polite, but their eyes carried a distinct, unspoken judgment. They looked at me with the quiet, devastating sympathy reserved for a mother who had failed to raise a decent son. I recognized the desk sergeant from the local diner. He was a man who attended the same megachurch as Dean and Vanessa. I could see the bias in his rigid posture, in the way he deliberately avoided direct eye contact with me while shuffling the intake forms. The narrative had already been cemented in their minds before I even stepped foot in the building. To them, Vanessa was the archetype of virtue. She was the woman who prayed for the sick and raised money for the poor. She was simply incapable of fabricating a story. Therefore, by the basic laws of their small-town logic, Rowan had to be the monster. He was the unstable child of a broken first marriage, lashing out at the saintly woman trying to hold the family together. The script was written, and they were all just playing their parts. I waited on a hard plastic chair, counting the agonizing minutes, refusing to let the rising panic show on my face. Finally, a heavy metal door clicked open, and a tired-looking officer led Rowan out into the lobby. My breath caught in my throat. He was not bleeding, and there were no obvious signs of a brutal physical beating, but he looked entirely broken. His blue button-down shirt, the one he had ironed so carefully before leaving my house earlier that evening, was rumpled, torn at the hem, and untucked. But the worst part was his wrists. Bright, angry red bands circled his pale skin where the heavy steel handcuffs had bitten into him. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw the devastating realization of a young man who had just learned a terrible, permanent lesson about the world. He had just learned that the truth is not a magic shield. He realized that the truth simply does not matter if the person telling the lie is more well-liked and more thoroughly believed. I signed the release papers in absolute silence. I did not ask the officers any questions. I did not demand a supervisor or scream about injustice. I knew better than to argue with people who had already closed the book on the investigation. I took my son by the arm, guiding him gently but firmly, and we walked out of the suffocating, judgmental air of the precinct and into the freezing night. The drive home was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence that felt thick enough to choke on. The amber glow of the street lights flickered rhythmically across the dashboard, casting long, shifting shadows across Rowan's face. He stared blankly out the passenger window, his hands resting limply in his lap, looking like a prisoner of war who had just been released, but knew the war was far from over. I desperately wanted to pull the car over to the shoulder, wrap my arms around him, and hold him tight. I wanted to stroke his hair and promise him that everything would be all right, that this was just a terrible nightmare we would wake up from. But I knew that would be a lie. And right now, in the darkest hour of the morning, we could not afford the luxury of comforting lies. When we were halfway home, Rowan finally broke the silence. His voice was completely flat, drained of all emotion, sounding like an empty vessel echoing in the dark. He told me that Vanessa had not lost her temper in the heat of the moment. She had not yelled in sudden, uncontrolled fear. The argument had been escalating. Yes, but then in a terrifying split-second instant her entire demeanor had shifted. The mask of the frightened, overwhelmed stepmother had completely vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. She had stepped directly into his personal space, invading his boundaries, her face mere inches from his. Rowan turned to look at me, his eyes wide and haunted in the dim green light of the car cabin. He told me exactly what she had said right before she picked up her phone to dial emergency services and perform her role as the terrified victim. She had lowered her voice to a harsh, calculated whisper, ensuring Dean could not hear her from the other room. She had said by morning, "You will be the unstable one." A cold chill radiated down my spine, settling deep into the marrow of my bones. That single venomous sentence changed the entire landscape of the night. This was not a domestic dispute that had unfortunately gotten out of hand. This was not a tragic misunderstanding fueled by high emotions. This was an execution. Vanessa had carefully set a trap, and she had waited patiently for the perfect moment to spring it. She wanted to brand him. She wanted to create a permanent, irrefutable legal record of him as a violent, unstable young man, staining his future before his life had even truly begun. Most mothers in my position would have lost their minds right then and there. They would have slammed on the brakes, pulled out their cell phones, and called their ex-husbands to scream obscenities into the receiver. They would have driven straight to that pristine, perfectly manicured house, marched up the brick walkway, and pounded on the heavy oak front door until their hands bled, demanding justice and truth. They would have let the blinding rage take the wheel, burning everything down in a fiery explosion of maternal protection. But I am not most mothers. I am a compliance manager. I live in a world of rigorous audits, endless paper trails, and unassailable proof. I know that when someone tries to destroy a system or manipulate a narrative, they always leave a trace. They always make a critical mistake because they arrogantly assume they are smarter than the person looking at the records. I kept my eyes locked on the dark road ahead, my hands steady and unwavering on the leather wheel. I did not say a single word about revenge. I did not make any grand emotional promises to my son. Instead, I made a quiet, ironclad vow to myself in the silence of the car. From this exact second forward, the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Every interaction, every phone call, every text message, and every financial transaction would be ruthlessly scrutinized. Every claim Vanessa made from this moment on would be treated as a hostile, high-stakes audit. I would document every breath she took. She wanted to play a vicious game of narratives, relying on her sweet voice, her perfect reputation, and her charity garler smiles to crush my son and paint him as a villain. She thought she had already won the war because the police believed her performance tonight. But she had made one catastrophic, irreversible miscalculation. She had attacked a boy whose mother knew exactly how to dismantle a manufactured reality piece by piece until nothing but the ugly truth remained. She had unknowingly started a war of documentation, and she had absolutely no idea how thoroughly she was about to be audited. By the time I pulled into our quiet driveway and put the car in park, the initial shock had completely burned away, leaving nothing behind but a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. The morning sunlight bled through the kitchen blinds, painting pale, useless stripes across the linoleum floor. I stood at the stove, mechanically cracking eggs into a hot skillet, letting the sizzle fill the heavy silence of the house. I was trying to construct normally out of bacon grease and toasted bread, moving through my usual Saturday morning routine as if the world had not tilted off its axis just a few hours ago. I slid a plate across the island counter. Rowan sat on the wooden stool, staring down at the yellow yolks as if they were a complex puzzle he lacked the energy to solve. He had showered, his wet hair combed neatly to the side, but the dark circles under his eyes bruised his pale skin. He picked up his fork, pushed a piece of toast around the ceramic rim, and set the utensil down with a quiet clatter. He looked up at me. His voice was incredibly small, stripped of the deep resonance it had acquired over the last year. He asked what we were going to do if everyone simply believed her. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, keeping my hands steady, refusing to let the ceramic mug tremble. I told him we would make them believe the facts instead. I sounded much more certain than I felt. Leaving his breakfast untouched, he retreated to his bedroom, the door clicking shut with a finality that twisted my stomach. I took my coffee to the living room, picked up my phone, and dialed his father. I needed to hear Dean say it was a misunderstanding. I needed him to be the man I had once married, a man who would tear the world apart to protect his child. Dean answered on the fourth ring. His voice was thick with exhaustion, carrying the raspy weight of someone who had spent the entire night justifying a catastrophe. I did not yell. I asked him point blank how he could have let his son be taken away in handcuffs. A long defensive sigh hissed through the receiver. Dean did not offer apologies or demand to know how Rowan was holding up. Instead, he slipped instantly into the rehearsed cadence of a mediator who had already chosen a side. He told me Vanessa was just terribly frightened. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of forced parental concern, and said that Rowan had been acting very impulsive lately. He said the boy had been carrying a lot of dark energy and that Vanessa had simply felt threatened in her own home. The words landed on me like lead weights. Dark energy, impulsive. These were not Dean's words. Dean barely noticed when the houseplants died, let alone the nuanced psychological state of a teenager. He was pairing her. He was regurgitating the exact vocabulary Vanessa had fed him. In that single sickening moment, I understood the depth of my ex-husband's complicity. Dean was not an evil man plotting against his own flesh and blood. He was merely a coward. He was a man who craved peace at any cost, and choosing to believe his beautiful, socially beloved wife's narrative was infinitely easier than facing the horrific possibility that she had orchestrated the arrest of his son. He wanted the comfortable version of reality, and he was willing to sacrifice Rowan to keep it. I ended the call without saying goodbye. There was nothing left to extract from a man who had already surrendered. By 10:00 that morning, the true scope of Vanessa's strategy began to materialize. Not in legal documents, but in the digital bloodstream of Cedar Hollow. I was sitting at my laptop trying to draft an email to my supervisor to request a few days of personal leave when my phone vibrated with a text from another local mother. It was a screenshot. Vanessa had posted a lengthy update on her social media page. She did not use Rowan's name. She was far too calculated to open herself up to a direct defamation claim. Instead, she posted a picture of a single lit candle against a dark background. The caption beneath, it was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom. She wrote about the trials of a blended family, the unseen struggles of step-parenting, and the heavy burden of loving a young man in the house who was currently struggling with severe emotional control issues. She ended the post by asking her vast network of followers to respect their privacy during this terrifying ordeal and to please keep their family in their prayers. It was a brilliantly executed strike. Within 2 hours, the post had garnered hundreds of supportive reactions and comments from community leaders, church members, and local business owners. They were all praising her strength and her boundless grace under fire. Then the secondary shockwave hit. Rowan's phone began to buzz frantically from the other room. He walked out, his face completely drained of color, holding the device out to me. His classmates had seen the post. The whispers had amplified into direct interrogations. A friend had sent him a screenshot of a group chat where kids were asking if Rowan had really lost his mind and attacked his stepmom. Another message bluntly asked if he was going to juvenile detention. The reputation he had spent 4 years building as a quiet honor student was disintegrating in real time, replaced by the caricature of a violent, unhinged teenager. But the social execution was only the surface level of the threat. I'd opened my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick folder containing his college preparation materials. My eyes scanned the terms and conditions of the local Rotary Club academic grant he had been awarded just last month. It was a substantial sum that would cover his entire freshman year tuition. There, buried in the third paragraph of the morality clause, was the fatal stipulation. The grant required the recipient to maintain exemplary community standing and explicitly stated that any pending criminal charges, especially those involving violence or domestic disturbances, would result in an immediate suspension and review of the funds. Vanessa was not just trying to embarrass him. She was actively setting fire to his future. She was dismantling his escape route out of this town. Rowan went to the hallway closet to grab a fresh sweatshirt. As he tossed his phone onto the kitchen counter, it slid under the overhead light, and I noticed the top corner of the glass screen protector was newly cracked, a jagged spiderweb pattern radiating outward. I picked it up, running my thumb over the shattered glass. I asked him how it broke. He swallowed hard, looking away. He explained that when the argument in the study had started to escalate, when Vanessa had suddenly shifted her tone and stepped into his space, his anxiety had spiked. He told me he had developed a nervous habit over the last year of secretly opening the voice memo application on his phone and hitting record whenever he felt cornered just to have proof that he was not the one starting the fights. He had tried to do it last night, fumbling with the device in his pocket, but it had slipped from his grasp and hit the hardwood floor right before she called the police. My pulse hammered in my ears. I unlocked his screen and opened the audio application. There, sitting at the very top of the list, was a file dated today, timed at just before 1 in the morning. My fingers hovered over the screen. If he had captured her threat, if he had recorded the moment she promised to make him look unstable, the entire police report would crumble. I tapped the play icon. The audio was chaotic and muffled, filled with the rustling of fabric and the harsh scraping of a chair being pushed back abruptly. It lasted for exactly 11 seconds. Then there was a sharp thud, likely the phone hitting the floor, and the recording cut off abruptly, as if the impact had stopped the application or someone had hurriedly stepped on it to silence it. It did not contain the threat. It was far too brief to serve as definitive exoneration in a court of law. A wave of bitter disappointment washed over me, but I refused to let it settle. I am a compliance auditor. I do not listen to what is missing. I listened to what is actually there. I connected the phone to my laptop, transferred the file, and put on my noise-canceling headphones. I played the 11 seconds again. Then I played it a third time, closing my eyes to isolate the layers of sound. There were two distinct anomalies. hidden beneath the rustling. The first was a rhythmic metallic clinking sound in the background. It was a very specific hollow ringing, exactly like the heavy brass wind chimes hanging on Dean's back patio. But Vanessa had explicitly told the police that the altercation had occurred entirely within the confines of the central living room, a space located at the very front of the sprawling house, far away from the patio doors. The second anomaly was a single sentence spoken by Vanessa, captured just a fraction of a second before the phone hit the ground. Her voice was not trembling. It was sharp, authoritative, and completely composed. She said, "Do not make me do this in front of him." I stopped the playback. The silence in my headphones was deafening. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark screen of my computer. "Do not make me do this in front of him." I meticulously replayed my conversation with Dean from an hour ago. I replayed everything the intake officers had indicated at the precinct. Dean had claimed Vanessa was frightened. He had claimed Rowan was impulsive. But not once, not in any of the official narratives circulating so far, had Dean ever claimed to have been physically present in the room when the supposed physical threat took place. The established story was that Dean had been out in the garage or in another wing of the house, rushing in only after the shouting had peaked. Yet the audio proved someone else was standing right there, someone Vanessa did not want to perform her ultimate lie in front of. She had crafted a beautiful, seamless story for the authorities, a narrative so smooth and compelling that the entire town had already swallowed it whole. But perfect stories are inherently dangerous to their creators. In the real world, under the harsh light of a chronological audit, perfection always cracks. The metadata does not care about your social standing, and acoustic reflections do not lie to protect your reputation. I opened a brand new spreadsheet on my laptop. I titled the first column with the word time, the second location, and the third with inconsistencies. I typed in the detail about the metallic chimes and the specific phrasing of the hidden pronoun. The suffocating weight in my chest began to recede, replaced by the cold, precise machinery of my profession. Vanessa thought she was dealing with a distraught, helpless mother who would waste her energy crying over an unfair system. She was wrong. I was not going to cry. I was going to forensically dismantle her life. I drove to the office supply store right when the manager unlocked the front glass doors. I walked straight to the organizational aisle and purchased a heavy-duty, 3-ring binder, the kind with rigid plastic covers that snapped shut with the heavy finality of a bank vault. When I returned to my quiet house, I cleared everything off the large mahogany dining room table. I wiped the surface clean. This was no longer a matter of hurt feelings, miscommunication, or maternal outrage. This was a compliance audit, and I was the lead investigator. I opened a pack of heavy cards, stock dividers, and began labeling the tabs with a thick black marker. I divided the empty binder into 6 distinct colored sections: time, testimony, devices, witnesses, financial, legal. The exact same rigorous emotionless structure I used to track corporate fleet fraud at Larker was now the arma I was building to save my son from a fabricated criminal record. Every single scrap of paper, every digital timestamp, every fleeting interaction would be filed, relentlessly cross-referenced, and ultimately weaponized. By 2:00 in the afternoon, the ambient temperature had dropped, bringing a bitter chill to the air as I pulled into the asphalt parking lot of Bell Family Council. I sat in the cramped, windowless office of June Hargrove. June was an old acquaintance, a sharp-featured woman who had navigated the murky, treacherous waters of family law to lose her patience for theatrical tears and performative outrage. Her desk was completely buried under stacks of yellow legal pads, red file folders, and half-empty ceramic coffee cups. I laid out the preliminary timeline I had constructed that morning. She listened to me without interrupting a single time, rhythmically tapping the eraser end of a yellow pencil against her chin. When I finally finished detailing the situation, she did not offer me any false hope or comforting empty platitudes. She leaned forward in her leather chair, her dark eyes sharp and entirely devoid of sentimentality. She looked at me and said that if my opponent lived her life by her public image, I had to kill her with procedure. June then opened a manila folder and slid a single crisp sheet of white paper across the desk toward me. It was a document that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. It was an official notice of a temporary protective order. Vanessa had not just called the police the night before. She had rushed to a district judge first thing this very morning to legally bar Rowan from coming within 500 feet of her vehicle, or her property. June pointed the tip of her pencil directly at the judge's signature, her voice dropping to a low, stern warning. She explained that this legal order was a highly sensitive tripwire. If Rowan posted a single angry status update on the internet, if he sent a text message to a classmate venting his frustrations about his stepmother, or if he even clicked a button to like a social media comment criticizing her, Vanessa would immediately capture it. She would present it to the judge as irrefutable proof of his volatile, unpredictable nature. He had to become a total ghost. Any emotional reaction, no matter how justified, would perfectly validate the exact psychological profile she had carefully built for him. I returned home to find Rowan sitting on the edge of his unmade bed, staring blankly at the bare wall. I sat down right beside him, keeping my voice incredibly calm as I explained the severe parameters of the protective order and the absolute non-negotiable necessity of his digital silence. The harsh reality of the legal snare actively tightening around his throat seemed to finally break through his layer of shock. He realized that keeping his head down and hoping for the best was no longer a viable survival strategy. I asked him to walk me through the weeks leading up to the arrest, urging him to look for anything out of the ordinary, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. He hesitated for a long moment, his hands nervously wringing the bottom hem of his shirt. He confessed that for the past month, Vanessa had been repeatedly cornering him in the hallway or the kitchen, pushing folded pieces of paper in front of him. She had been aggressively demanding he sign receipts, acknowledging he had received his full monthly living allowance from his father. But Rowan had not seen a single dollar of that money in months. When he had gathered the courage to question her about it, she would quickly dismiss it as a mere accounting formality, assuring him with a tight smile that the funds were just being redirected to cover his upcoming college preparation expenses. The scattered pieces of broken glass were starting to catch the light, revealing a completely different picture. This was not a domestic dispute at all. I was beginning to strongly suspect this was a financial cover-up. I pressed him further, asking what had specifically sparked the argument last night before the police were called. Rowan closed his eyes, his breathing growing shallow as he forced himself to recall the details. He said Vanessa had sent him into his father's study to grab a heavy manila envelope she claimed Dean wanted him to take home for me. Dean was not in the room, but there was a thick stack of manila folders resting openly on the center of the dark leather desk blocked. Rowan had only glanced at the top page, but Vanessa had walked into the study right at that exact moment. He remembered the color completely draining from her face. That was the precise moment she snapped. That was when she backed him into a corner and began the aggressive, rapidly escalating confrontation that ultimately ended with him in steel handcuffs. She did not lose her temper because he was acting like a disrespectful teenager. She lost her mind because he was looking at a very specific file. I left his bedroom and went straight back to the dining room table, pulling my laptop toward me. If there were physical files concerning Rowan's money sitting on that desk, Dean would undoubtedly have a digital trail somewhere. Dean was notoriously disorganized, frequently forwarding sensitive emails to the wrong address or replying to all by mistake. I opened my personal inbox and initiated a deep search through my archived messages from Dean over the last 6 months. I scrolled past endless mind-numbing logistics about weekend visitation schedules, dental appointments, and shared insurance deductibles. Then, buried deep in a mundane thread from early October, I found it. It was a forwarded message with an attachment title that made my breath hitch in my throat. It read Mercer Family Education Reserve Revision. The problem was when I clicked on the attachment icon, a stark error message popped up on my screen stating the file had been recalled by the sender before I had ever opened it. Someone, likely Vanessa monitoring his account, had realized the massive mistake and yanked the document back into the digital ether. But the boast of the title remained in my inbox, a permanent digital fingerprint, proving that the foundational terms of Rowan's college trust fund were being quietly altered entirely behind my back. My cell phone buzzed violently against the wooden table. It was an encrypted text message from June. She had called in a favor and managed to pull a preliminary copy of the arresting officer's incident report along with the official emergency dispatch logs. I immediately printed the digital documents, the printer whirring loudly in the quiet house, and placed the warm sheets of paper side by side on my dining table. I illuminated them with the harsh, unforgiving glare of a brass desk lamp. I took the cap off a yellow highlighter and rammed the bright ink over Vanessa's official police statement. She claimed firmly on the record that Rowan had aggressively backed her against the living room wall and threatened her physical safety at exactly 12:56 in the morning. I then shifted my gaze to the printed dispatch log, tracing the black ink with the tip of my index finger. The emergency operator had received the frantic call for help placed directly from Vanessa's cellular phone at exactly 12:49 in the morning. I stared at the two spelled-out times until the letters burned themselves into my retinas. 12:49, 1256, a discrepancy of exactly 7 minutes in the chaotic adrenaline-fueled blur of an actual assault. People often lose track of time. A genuinely terrified victim might estimate the hour incorrectly or confuse the sequence of events. But Vanessa had not estimated. She had provided a highly specific concrete timestamp to the responding officers, likely looking at a digital clock to artificially solidify her narrative. But she had been entirely too precise. She had officially reported a violent, terrifying threat occurring 7 full minutes after she had already dialed the emergency authorities to report that very same threat. This tiny, seemingly insignificant gap in the timeline was nowhere near enough to get the criminal case dismissed on its own. It was not a smoking gun that would magically clear my son's name today, but to a compliance auditor sitting alone at a dining room table, it was absolutely everything. It was the very first structural fracture in a massive load-bearing wall. Vanessa had carefully constructed a story that was simply too perfectly round, too polished, and too undeniably neat. And I knew from years of ripping apart fraudulent corporate ledgers that perfectly round stories absolutely never survive the blinding, relentless light of a forensic audit. I did not send a single text message to Vanessa. I did not call my ex-husband to demand an explanation or scream into the receiver about the absolute absurdity of the situation. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that when a fraudster is feeling confident, the absolute worst thing you can do is interrupt them. You have to let them keep talking. You let them keep posting their thinly veiled updates online, letting them add layer upon layer to their fabricated narrative. Every public statement, every tearful social media video, and every whispered rumor she planted in the community was not a weapon against my son. It was another length of rope she was eagerly tying around her own neck. The silence from my end was intentional. It was the quiet, sterile environment of a laboratory preparing to dissect a specimen. I sat Rowan down at the dining room table right across from the heavy binder. I told him we needed to dissect the evening of the arrest, not in broad strokes, but second by second. We had to remove the emotion and treat his memory like a security camera recording. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. We started from the moment he walked through their front door at 6:00 that evening. He described the uncomfortable family dinner, the clinking of silverware, and the strained conversation. Then he reached the turning point. At roughly 8:30, Dean's cellular phone rang. It was a work emergency, so Dean excused himself, walking out through the utility mudroom and into the detached garage to take the call in private. That left Rowan and Vanessa alone in the kitchen. Rowan recalled that she suddenly stopped washing the dishes, turned to him, and asked him to do her a favor. She told him to go into his father's study and grab a specific heavy manila envelope resting on the leather chair. She said it was something Dean needed him to take home from me. My pen froze over my legal pad. She had sent him in there. He had not wandered into the study looking for a fight. She had deliberately directed him into the room where the financial documents were kept. I asked him to visualize the envelope. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, his brow furrowing as he dug into the chaotic memory of the night. He remembered walking into the dimly lit study. The envelope was not on the chair. It was resting squarely on the mahogany desk, partially spilling its contents. He told me he saw his grandmother's name printed on the top sheet of the thick paper stack. It was the paperwork for the Education Reserve, the trust fund his late grandmother had established exclusively for his university tuition. But there was something else. He remembered reaching out to push the papers back into the envelope, and his thumb brushed against a brightly colored emblem printed on the top right corner of a secondary document attached to the trust file. It was a blue lighthouse, the official logo for the Harbor Light Renewal Initiative. My chest tightened. Harbor Light was not a bank. It was not a financial institution or an academic scholarship board. It was the local community charity organization that Vanessa herself had founded and currently directed. It was the very foundation of her saintly reputation in Cedar Hollow. I immediately contacted June Hargrove. I told her I did not just need the police reports anymore. I needed financial visibility operating strictly within the legal boundaries of family law discovery. Since the Education Trust was still subject to family law discovery, because Rowan had only recently turned 18 and had not yet graduated from high school, June filed an expedited request for the recent bank statements attached to the reserve account. It took 3 agonizing days of waiting, 3 days of watching Vanessa post cryptic, sorrowful quotes about forgiveness on her digital feeds before the courier dropped the sealed package on my porch. I spread the bank statements across the table, using a metal ruler to guide my eyes down the endless columns of numbers. At first glance, the account looked healthy. The principal balance from his grandmother was largely intact. But as I traced the withdrawal column over the last 14 months, a distinct, insidious pattern emerged. There were no massive glaring transfers that would trigger an automatic fraud alert from the bank. Instead, there was a steady rhythmic bleed. $200 here, $450 there, $600 right before the holidays. Every single one of these micro withdrawals was labeled with the exact same vague memo line, Event Coordination Logistics, and every single transfer was routed directly into the operational accounts of the Harbor Light Renewal Initiative. The reality of her scheme crystallized in my mind. The amounts were small enough to fly entirely under the radar of a careless man like Dean, who simply trusted his wife to manage the household administration. Vanessa was slowly siphoning money out of her stepson's secure college fund and funneling it into her charity. She was likely using his inheritance to artificially inflate her organization's operating budget, paying for the lavish community galas and catered charity events that kept her face on the front page of the local newspaper. She was buying her flawless reputation with my son's future. This completely shifted the gravitational center of the entire crisis. If Rowan had seen those specific documents that night, if his eyes had processed the connection between his grandmother's trust and the charity logo right before she walked into the room, her motive transformed instantly. She did not call the police because she was a fragile woman dealing with a moody teenager. She called the authorities to completely destroy his credibility. She needed to brand him as a violent, untrustworthy, and unstable liar before he ever had the chance to understand the financial crime he had accidentally stumbled upon. A convicted, volatile teenager claiming his perfect stepmother is stealing from him sounds like a desperate, vindictive lie. It was a preemptive strike to silence a witness. I needed a professional to verify my theory without tipping off the opposition. I spent the next afternoon tracking down Mara Bell. Mara was a quiet, highly meticulous freelance accountant who operated out of a small office above the hardware store downtown. According to the public tax filings I had pulled, Mara had been contracted to perform the end-of-quarter independent audits for Harbor Light for the past 3 years. I did not make an appointment. I simply waited by her car in the parking lot just after 5:00. When she saw me, her posture instantly stiffened. She knew who I was, and the hesitation in her eyes told me she desperately wanted to avoid any connection to the town's current favorite scandal. I did not threaten her. I did not raise my voice. I simply handed her a printed sheet of the transfer dates I had highlighted and asked her if these matched the event coordination invoices she had processed for the charity. Mara looked down at the paper, the harsh wind whipping her coat around her legs. She refused to hold the document, keeping her hands firmly stuffed in her pockets. She looked over her shoulder, ensuring the parking lot was empty. She told me she did not want any trouble. She stated very clearly that she only processed the paperwork she was given, but then her professional conscience seemed to wage a brief war with her fear of social ostracization. She lowered her voice to a fragile whisper. She admitted that for the last year, Vanessa had consistently submitted her expense reports weeks past the deadline. More importantly, Mara confessed that Vanessa frequently requested her to retroactively adjust the descriptions on the incoming funds, demanding that personal wire transfers be categorized as anonymous charitable donations to balance the event ledgers. Mara quickly turned, got into her sedan, and drove away without another word, leaving me standing alone in the cold asphalt lot. She had not given me a signed affidavit, but she had given me the exact confirmation I needed to proceed. I drove home through the darkening streets of Cedar Hollow, the heater blowing warm air against my freezing hands. The town looked peaceful, the street lamps casting a warm, deceptive glow over the perfectly manicured lawns. They all believed the monster was locked inside my house. They had absolutely no idea the real predator was the one organizing their Sunday bake sales. When I walked back into my dining room, the house was entirely silent. Rowan was asleep in his room, exhausted by the relentless emotional toll of his new reality. I sat down in my chair and pulled the heavy binder toward me. I flipped past the timeline, past the dispatch logs, and past the legal restrictions. I opened a blank sheet of lined paper in the financial section. I picked up my pen and wrote down a single defining sentence that would serve as the absolute true north for the remainder of this war. Vanessa was not afraid of Rowan hurting her. She was afraid of Rowan seeing exactly what he was not supposed to see. I closed the binder, the heavy plastic snapping shut with a sharp, satisfying crack. The defensive phase of this operation was officially over. It was time to start setting traps. The air inside our home grew heavier and more stagnant with each passing day, thickening into a suffocating pressure that made simply breathing feel like a monumental task. The social isolation did not happen all at once. It was a creeping, insidious frost that slowly covered every aspect of our lives. On Tuesday afternoon, an automated email arrived from the high school administration office. I stood behind my son at the kitchen counter, watching the blue light of the laptop screen wash over his pale, exhausted face as he read the brief, sterile message. He was formally suspended from his position as the captain of the regional debate team, pending a further verification of his character and disciplinary standing. The school claimed it was merely standard administrative protocol whenever law enforcement was involved. But the impact was devastating. Debate was not just an after-school hobby for him. It was his entire exit strategy. It was the polished intellectual key that was going to unlock the door out of Cedar Hollow and secure his place at a prestigious university hundreds of miles away from this valley. Watching him slowly close his laptop, his shoulders slumping under the weight of an invisible, crushing boulder, broke something very deep inside my chest. He did not say a word. He just walked back to his bedroom and shut the door. By Wednesday, the whisper campaign had fully saturated the local ecosystem, evolving from quiet gossip into accepted historical fact. I was walking down the canned goods aisle of the local grocery store, my head down, when I overheard two prominent mothers from the Parent-Teacher Association whispering near the end cap. One of them confidently stated with a tone of deep manufactured pity that my son had a long, thoroughly documented history of severe emotional instability. She claimed he had always possessed a dark streak that the family had simply tried to hide. There was absolutely no such record. He had never even seen a school counselor for a behavioral issue. He had never been in a single hallway fight. The rumor was a deliberately planted, highly cultivated seed designed to pre-correct the narrative before we ever stepped foot inside a courtroom. Someone was actively fertilizing the ground of public opinion, ensuring that when the legal hammer finally fell, the entire town would simply nod in unison and say they saw it coming all along. I abandoned my shopping cart right there in the aisle and walked out into the freezing parking lot. As I unlocked my car, my phone vibrated in my heavy wool coat pocket. It was a text message from Dean. It was not an apology. It was not a desperate, frantic plea to see his boy and make things right. It was a cowardly, carefully worded directive sent from a man terrified of losing his comfortable existence. He wrote that he sincerely hoped I would not turn this unfortunate situation into a dirty war. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared at the glowing screen until the words burned themselves into my retinas. A dirty war. Dean was a man who avoided conflict with the dedication of a religious zealot. If he was preemptively asking me to stand down, if he was already framing my potential defense of our son as dirty, it meant he was already acutely aware that there was a massive war waiting to be fought. It meant he knew about the shifting funds, or at the very least, he knew far more than the shocked, grieving father routine he had played on the phone days earlier. He was desperately trying to protect the status quo, shielding his eyes from the blinding, radioactive glare of his new wife's deceit. My grim epiphany in the parking lot was abruptly interrupted by a phone call from June. She told me to come to her office immediately, offering no pleasantries or context. When I arrived, she did not offer me a seat. She had a single, freshly printed document spread across her cluttered wooden desk. It was an official legal addendum, a modification to the original Education Reserve Trust established by his late grandmother. June pointed the tip of her silver pen at a newly inserted clause buried deep in the dense, impenetrable legal jargon on page 4. The clause stated in unambiguous ironclad terms that if the beneficiary were to ever pose a risk to the physical or emotional safety of the Mercer family household, all temporary financial control and disbursement authority of the trust would immediately default to the designated financial guardian, and the designated financial guardian, listed in bold ink at the very bottom of the page, was Vanessa. The remaining oxygen vanished from the small office. Neither I nor my son had ever received a single written or verbal notification about this amendment. If the domestic violence charge against him managed to stick in the legal system, if the temporary protective order was validated by a judge and made permanent, Vanessa would not just win a moral victory in the eyes of the town. She would gain absolute, unquestioned legal authority over hundreds of thousands of dollars. She would completely control his university tuition. Furthermore, she would gain administrative control over the small residential condominium his grandmother had purchased near the university campus, a property intended solely for him to live in during his undergraduate studies. The sheer terrifying brilliance of the trap finally revealed itself. The orchestrated argument, the carefully timed emergency phone call, the tears at the police station. It was never about managing a rebellious teenager or punishing a disrespectful stepson. It was a hostile corporate takeover deliberately disguised as a tragic family dispute. She needed a formal criminal record to legally disenfranchise him. She was using the local police department and the district court system as her own private wealth management enforcers, ensuring he lost all access to his inheritance by his own supposedly violent hand. A profound, sickening wave of grief washed over me, but to my own surprise, it was not directed at Vanessa. A predator will always act like a predator. You cannot be angry at a snake for possessing venom. My grief, heavy and suffocating, was entirely for the man whose signature was scrolled at the bottom of that addendum. Dean had signed that document just 3 weeks ago. He had legally signed away his own son's future security without even bothering to pick up the telephone and ask the boy a single question about it. He had let his new wife whisper financial poison into his ear under the guise of household safety, and he had simply nodded his head and reached for a pen. This was the deepest wound of the entire ordeal. It was a soft, quiet kind of betrayal, born of sheer laziness and a desperate, pathetic need to avoid arguments at the dinner table, but a soft betrayal destroys a life just as thoroughly and permanently as a violent one. His passivity was a weapon that had just gutted his own child. June watched me process the magnitude of the document. Her hands folded quietly on her desk. She likely expected me to break down into tears, to hurl a ceramic coffee cup against the wall in a fit of maternal rage, or to finally succumb to the overwhelming, crushing pressure of an entire town and a legal system closing in around my family. Instead, the cold, clinical machinery of my professional background locked securely into place. The boiling anger completely evaporated, leaving behind a frozen, desolate landscape of pure tactical calculation. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the wooden desk right next to the addendum. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly into my lawyer's eyes and asked her to immediately file a formal motion of discovery for the digital metadata of that specific document. I told her I did not care about the final printed copy sitting in front of us. I wanted the complete revision history from the cloud server. I wanted to know the exact date and time the file was created. I wanted to know the specific brand and model of the device that had generated the text. I wanted the invisible digital footprints of the person who had actually typed those words, because I was absolutely certain Dean had not written a single letter of it. The heavy oak front door of my house knocked just past 2 in the afternoon on a rainy Thursday. I fully expected to find another delivery driver on the porch, or perhaps a nosy neighbor coming to drop off a passive-aggressive casserole under the guise of community support. Instead, I opened the door to find Evelyn Mercer standing there holding a sleek black umbrella against the driving wind. Evelyn was the older biological sister of Dean. During the entirety of my marriage to her brother, we had never been particularly close, maintaining a polite, highly distant relationship built entirely on holiday greetings and forced smiles at family reunions. But Evelyn was a woman who possessed a razor-sharp intuition and completely lacked her brother's cowardly need to constantly please the crowd. She had always viewed Vanessa with a quiet, narrowed gaze, never quite buying the angelic, selfless performance that had so easily mesmerized the rest of Cedar Hollow. Evelyn did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She stepped quickly into my foyer, shook the rain from her dark coat, and pulled a small silver flash drive from her leather purse. She held it out to me, her expression grim and unyielding. She told me she had been reviewing the video files from her vehicle's dashboard camera. 3 weeks prior, she had parked her car at the end of Dean's long brick driveway to drop off a birthday gift, waiting in her idling vehicle while he finished a phone call inside. The camera had been quietly recording the entire duration of her wait. I led her directly to the dining room table and plugged the small drive into my laptop. The video player opened, showing a clear, high-definition view of the Mercer driveway from 3 weeks ago. The scene started peacefully enough, but then Rowan's small sedan pulled into the frame. Before he could even put the vehicle in park, the heavy front door of the house swung open, and Vanessa marched out. Her posture was entirely different from the fragile, frightened woman she played so perfectly for the police and the public. Her shoulders were squared, her stride aggressive, and her entire demeanor dominant. She walked directly to the driver's side window, physically blocking my son from exiting his own car. The microphone on Evelyn's dashboard camera was highly sensitive, picking up the audio across the driveway distance with chilling clarity. Vanessa's voice was sharp, venomous, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She leaned down, pointing a rigid finger at the glass, and delivered a clear, commanding directive. She told him, "You will not embarrass me in my own house." I paused the video playback. My eyes drifted to the blurred, distant background of the digital frame. Standing near the front porch steps, perfectly visible in the afternoon daylight, was Dean. He was watching the entire hostile exchange unfold, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets, making absolutely no move to intervene or de-escalate the situation. This silent, undeniable digital record did not technically exonerate Rowan of the specific events on the night of his arrest. However, it detonated a massive, irreparable hole in the carefully crafted psychological profile Vanessa had sold to the authorities. A woman who is supposedly living in constant terror of her volatile, unpredictable steps and does not aggressively trap him inside his vehicle and issue cold, calculated threats while her husband watches passively from the porch. The fragile victim narrative was a complete structural fabrication, and I finally had the hard visual proof to shatter it. Evelyn took her flash drive back, gave me a single affirming nod, and walked out into the rain without another word. She had just delivered the first real weapon into my hands. The momentum of the day was far from over. Just a few hours later, my encrypted email inbox pinged with a secure message from an unknown sender. I instantly knew it was Maribel. She had not included any text in the body of the email, only a single attached spreadsheet document. I downloaded the file and opened it, my eyes quickly scanning the dense rows of financial data. It was the complete cost reconciliation ledger for the harbor, light charity events over the past 12 months. Mara had taken my initial theory and quietly connected the final devastating dots on her own accord. I cross-referenced the event coordination expenses she had specifically highlighted in yellow. A highly significant portion of the charity funds, the exact same funds that had been silently siphoned from my son's education reserve, were not being paid to local caterers or standard event planners in the area. They were being steadily routed into a limited liability company called Vale Orchard Consulting. I immediately opened a new browser tab and accessed the state business registry, paying the $20 processing fee to pull the official incorporation documents for that specific entity. The registered owner of Vale Orchard Consulting was not an anonymous corporate conglomerate. It was a woman named Claire Vale. She was the first cousin of Vanessa, living entirely out of state. The embezzlement ring was fully closed. Vanessa was draining the trust fund, washing the stolen money through her pristine charity, and then paying it out to a fake consulting firm owned by her own blood relative. She was completely robbing my son blind, while actively asking the entire town to pray for his troubled soul before I could even process the full staggering gravity of the financial theft. My cellular phone rang. It was June Hargrove, and she was practically vibrating with professional adrenaline. She had just received the metadata report from the digital forensic firm we had hired to examine the trust fund addendum. The official story presented by the opposition was that the family estate lawyer had drafted the new terms at Dean's specific request to protect the assets from a troubled teenager, but the digital fingerprint told a drastically different story. June explained that the original digital file containing the restrictive clauses had not been authored by a legal professional at all. The creator tag firmly embedded in the document properties belonged to a specific user profile. The profile name was Vanessa Vale Mercer. The document had been created on her personal laptop, heavily edited over the course of 5 consecutive days, and then simply presented to Dean for his blind, trusting signature. She had personally engineered the exact legal instrument required to legitimize her theft. I called Rowan into the dining room immediately. I needed him to reach back into the chaotic, terrifying memory of the argument one more time. I told him to focus entirely on the words Vanessa was shouting at him right before she dialed the authorities, ignoring everything else. He sat down, staring intently at the wood grain of the table, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He told me she kept pushing him backwards toward the wall, her voice rising in a frantic, almost theatrical panic. But then he remembered a highly specific accusation she kept aggressively repeating. He said she kept demanding he admit he was just angry about the tuition money. She kept yelling that he was losing his temper because of the recent financial changes. I stopped breathing. The underlying logic of the entire night suddenly clicked perfectly into place, locking with a resounding, deafening finality. Rowan had absolutely no idea the trust fund addendum even existed on the night of the arrest. He had never been told about any financial changes. Therefore, it was logically impossible for him to be violently angry about a theft he did not yet comprehend. In the heat of the staged confrontation, Vanessa had completely panicked. When she saw him looking at the paperwork on the desk, she assumed he had read the new terms. She assumed her entire embezzlement scheme had just been exposed. She did not invent a random lie to get him in trouble. She projected her own terror directly onto him. The only person in that room who was obsessively fixated on the education funds, the only person whose entire physical reaction was driven by the fear of those documents, was Vanessa herself. She had accidentally handed him her own motive. I stood up from the table, my mind operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. I walked over to the heavy binder, flipping open the metal rings and inserting the printed dash cam stills, the financial ledgers, and the digital forensic report. The final counterattack strategy was officially set. I realized I did not need to stand in a courtroom and desperately try to prove that Vanessa was a greedy, manipulative monster. That strategy would just look like the bitter, emotional ramblings of a jealous ex-wife. Juries and judges are naturally suspicious of emotional character assassinations. Instead, I was going to do something much worse. I was going to use the rigid, undeniable laws of space-time and documented knowledge to prove that she had entirely fabricated his motive out of her own desperate panic. I was going to demonstrate that every single accusation she leveled against him was actually a detailed chronological confession of her own crimes. I was going to let her perfect, immaculate image stand completely unchallenged right up until the exact moment the sheer weight of her own documented lies crushed it into dust. The discipline of absolute silence is the hardest tactic to master in any conflict. Following the strict counsel of my attorney, I instituted a total blackout on our end. We did not post a single public rebuttal on any social media platform. We did not issue a tearful statement to the local newspaper. I explicitly forbade my son from defending himself to his peers, no matter how vicious the rumors in the high school hallways became. It felt unnatural and agonizing to absorb the blows without raising a shield. But it was a calculated necessity. I needed the opposition to look across the battlefield and see nothing but a frightened, overwhelmed mother and a guilty, sullen teenager. I needed them to firmly believe that our entire defense strategy consisted of nothing more than raw emotion and panic. People who believe they are fighting an unstructured, emotional opponent inevitably get sloppy. They stop checking their blind spots. They start taking unnecessary risks because they feel utterly invincible. The silence worked exactly as intended. Emboldened by our apparent lack of resistance and fueled by the echoing chamber of community sympathy, Vanessa made the precise, catastrophic mistake I had been patiently waiting for. She overplayed her hand, not content with a simple domestic dispute charge. She clearly wanted to guarantee that the permanent protective order would be granted, thereby securing her absolute control over the education trust. To achieve this, her legal counsel submitted a supplementary exhibit to the district court. When June called me into her office to review the new discovery material, she did not look worried. She looked like a predator that had just caught the scent of blood. Resting on her cluttered desk was a higher-resolution color copy of a handwritten diary. According to the sworn affidavit attached to the exhibit, Vanessa claimed to have kept this private journal continuously over the past 8 months. The pages detailed a harrowing, steadily escalating narrative of my son growing increasingly aggressive, deeply unfilteredly obsessed with the financial dynamics of the household. At first glance, the physical artifact was undeniably persuasive. It was a masterpiece of manufactured authenticity. The pages were slightly yellowed and dojered at the corners. She had intentionally used several different colors of ink, switching between blue, black, and even a red ballpoint pen to simulate the passage of time. There were even faint circular coffee stains artfully stamped onto a few of the dates, creating the perfect visual illusion of a frightened woman quietly documenting her hidden nightmare over many long, stressful mornings. It was a beautiful piece of theater, but it was completely fake, and we were going to tear it apart atom by atom. June had immediately securely transmitted the scanned pages to a forensic document examiner she kept on retainer in the state capitol. The expert's preliminary report arrived 48 hours later, and it was devastatingly. While the varying ink colors and coffee stains were a nice, theatrical touch, the underlying physical mechanics of the handwriting completely betrayed the forgery. The examiner noted that the pen pressure and the physical indentation depth on the paper were virtually identical across entries supposedly written months apart, a biomechanical impossibility for a human being experiencing varying states of emotional distress over a long period. Furthermore, the left and right margins were unnaturally consistent. But the most glaring flaw was the vocabulary scattered throughout the tear-stained entries were highly specific, sterile legal phrases. Phrases like pattern of escalating hostility and documented fear of physical proximity. A terrified stepmother venting in a private diary does not casually utilize the exact statutory language required to secure a permanent protective order in our jurisdiction. The diary was obviously a retroactive fabrication drafted entirely in a single frantic sitting, but proving it was a forgery was only half the battle. I needed to prove the exact timeline of its creation to completely destroy her credibility. That was when a seemingly random forgotten memory from 6 months ago suddenly ignited in my mind. I remembered a weekend when my son had returned home from his father's house highly frustrated. He had spent his entire Saturday afternoon troubleshooting a wireless network issue for his stepmother. Vanessa had purchased a high-end cloud-connected laser printer for her home office, but could not figure out how to synchronize it with her network. My son, always the designated technical support for the family, had eventually fixed it. But during the frustrating process, he had taken a photograph of the printer's rear diagnostic panel to send to a tech-savvy friend for advice. I rushed back to my house, pulled his cell phone, and furiously scrolled back through his archived digital photo gallery. I found the image. It was a blurry, poorly lit photograph, but perfectly centered in the frame was the printer's bright white sticker displaying the device's exact media access control address and the serial number. I forwarded the photograph to June immediately, armed with the specific hardware identification numbers. She filed a highly targeted emergency subpoena directly to the device manufacturer's cloud service provider, demanding the digital print spooler logs for the specific network associated with the Mercer residence. We requested the data covering the precise 14-day window leading up to the filing of the temporary protective order. The digital logs arrived 3 days before our scheduled pre-trial mediation, and they were the final lethal nails in the coffin. The automated server records completely bypassed the local computer hard drive, making them impossible for a standard user to delete or alter. The logs showed that on 2 consecutive nights, just 48 hours before the domestic violence arrest occurred, that specific printer had processed a massive queue of documents. The file names sent to the printer were a sequence of titles like Entry 1 Rewrite, Entry 2 Final, and Timeline Adjustment. Moreover, the logs indicated that during that exact same late-night window, the user account registered to Vanessa was actively operating a master word processing document titled Behavior Timeline. She had not written a diary over 8 months. She had typed a script on her laptop over 2 nights, printed it out as a reference guide, and then painstakingly copied her own fictional narrative by hand into a notebook to make it look authentic. I held the printed logs in my trembling hands, feeling a cold, terrifying sense of absolute power. I possessed the exact tools to enter completely. I could have called the police right then. I could have leaked the logs to the community board, but I did not. I carefully placed the documents into the legal section of my heavy binder and snapped the ring shut. I was not going to give her the opportunity to pivot or invent an excuse in private. I was going to let her walk blindly into a trap of her own making, surrounded by the legal authorities she had tried to weaponize against us. The following Tuesday morning, we attended the mandatory pretrial mediation session at the district courthouse. The room was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of stale floor wax and old paper. I sat directly next to my son at the long wooden conference table. Across from us sat my ex-husband, looking hollow and desperately uncomfortable, and Vanessa. Vanessa looked absolutely radiant. She wore a modest pale gray sweater, her hair pulled back into a simple, elegant clasp. She projected an aura of profound, exhausted grace. She truly believed she was holding all the cards. She believed our silence over the past few weeks was proof of our total surrender. The court-appointed mediator, an older gentleman with tired eyes, asked if anyone wanted to make an opening statement before we reviewed the parameters of the protective order. Vanessa gently placed her hand over her husband's hand. She looked across the table, bypassing me entirely, and locked her wide, sorrowful eyes directly onto my son. The room fell dead silent as she deployed her most devastating weapon. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly with perfectly calibrated emotion. She told him that despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and the terrible pain he had caused their family, she harbored no hatred in her heart. She leaned slightly forward and stated with a sickeningly sweet, deeply moralistic tone that she had already forgiven him even before he had the chance to apologize. I felt the air violently suck out of the room. Beside me, I felt my son's entire body go completely rigid. The sheer unadulterated audacity of her statement, the breathtaking cruelty of demanding an apology for a crime she had entirely fabricated, was a psychological blow designed to make him snap. I saw his jaw clench, the muscles feathering rapidly under his pale skin, his hands resting on his lap, curled into tight, shaking fists. He was half a second away from kicking his chair back, slamming his hands on the table, and screaming the truth at the top of his lungs. He was about to give her exactly the volatile reaction she desperately needed to validate her fake diary. I did not look at him. I kept my face entirely blank, staring straight ahead at the mediator, but under the heavy wooden table, out of sight from everyone else in the room. I reached over and grabbed my son's wrist. I dug my fingers into his forearm with a bruising iron grip. I squeezed until I felt his muscles twitch in surprise, silently ordering him to hold his ground. I held him back because I finally understood the ultimate rule of this terrible game. A premature strike only wounds the enemy. The final fatal blow only possesses true world-ending value when the opponent is absolutely fundamentally convinced that they have already won the war. I let her condescending forgiveness hang in the stale air of the mediation room, knowing with absolute certainty that it was the last time she would ever feel safe. The suffocating weight of the previous weeks finally began to fracture my son. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, just 48 hours before we were scheduled to stand before the district judge. The relentless social pressure of our small town, the agonizing suspension from his academic team, and above all, the deafening, cowardly silence from his father had slowly eroded his foundation. Gaslighting is a highly effective psychological weapon because it does not attack your physical reality right away. It attacks your confidence in your own perception. I found him sitting on the edge of the living room sofa, staring blankly at the dark television screen. The vibrant, focused young man who had been preparing for university debates just 1 month ago was entirely gone. He looked hollowed out, his shoulders hunched, completely drained of the quiet resilience he had always carried. When he finally spoke, his voice was a fragile, trembling whisper that shattered the silence of our home. He asked me if it was possible that he was remembering the night of the arrest incorrectly. He looked up at me with desperate, exhausted eyes, practically begging for me to confirm his worst fears. He asked if maybe he had actually lost his temper. He wondered if the stress of the college applications and the strained dynamic at his father's house had caused him to black out in a fit of rage. He asked if maybe he really had cornered her and threatened her, and his brain was simply blocking out the memory to protect him from the terrifying guilt. Every single maternal instinct embedded in my DNA screamed at me to rush across the room, pull him into a tight embrace, and stroke his hair. I wanted to tell him he was a good boy, that he was perfect, and that he could never do anything wrong. But false comfort is a dangerous luxury in a war of attrition. Empty platitudes would not shield him from a criminal conviction. I pulled a wooden chair over and sat directly in front of him, forcing him to meet my gaze. I kept my voice entirely level, stripping away any trace of panic or pity. I told him that the human brain is a highly flawed recording device, easily corrupted by adrenaline, trauma, and the relentless repetition of a false narrative by the people around us. I explained that under enough stress, anyone can be manipulated into doubting their own sanity. But I also told him that while human memory can shake and crumble under emotional pressure, hard data does not. Data does not possess a nervous system. Data cannot be intimidated by a social media campaign, and it certainly does not care about his stepmother's flawless public reputation. I instructed him to stop trying to defend his emotional state and trust the architecture of the truth we were building. Our only job was to locate the pieces of the night that could not tremble. Later that night, long after he had finally drifted into a restless sleep, I sat alone at my dining room table. The heavy binder was open in front of me, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the stark white pages. Tomorrow was the official hearing. It was the absolute final threshold. I had the financial ledgers, the digital creation logs for the fraudulent trust documents, and the dashboard camera footage. But the prosecutor would still argue that none of those things explicitly proved what transpired physically in the house during the exact moments leading up to the police dispatch. I opened the audio folder on my desktop. I stared at the 11-second voice memo my son had managed to capture before his phone hit the hardwood floor. I had listened to it a dozen times, identifying the metallic ringing I originally thought was a set of wind chimes. But my mind was restless, gnawing at the edges of the timeline. Working in compliance, I had access to a basic set of audio filtering tools on my corporate software, usually utilized for cleaning up muffled driver dispatch recordings. I did not expect a miraculous revelation, but I needed to exhaust every single avenue before the sun came up. I loaded the 11-second file into the filtering program, isolated the vocal track, and drastically amplified the background ambient noise. I put on my heavy noise-canceling headphones and closed my eyes, letting the digital scrub wash over my ears. The metallic sound played again, but stripped of the chaotic rustling of clothing and the frantic breathing. The true acoustic signature of the noise was completely exposed. It was not the light random tinkling of brass wind chimes blowing in a breeze. It was a single harsh-heavy impact of solid metal striking metal. My eyes snapped open. I knew exactly what that sound was. It was the distinct, heavy clash of the metal strike plate on the heavy wooden door connecting the rear mudroom to Dean's private study. I had lived in that house for 7 years. I had heard that exact door slam shut 1,000 times. The geographical layout of the property instantly materialized in my mind, fundamentally shifting the entire physical narrative of the alleged assault. In her sworn statement to the responding officers, Vanessa explicitly claimed that she was backing away from him, completely cornered in the central living room located at the very front of the sprawling house. But the heavy mudroom door was located entirely at the opposite end of the residence, directly adjacent to the study, where the financial documents were kept. The logic of the confrontation completely inverted. My son was not aggressively advancing on her in the family living area. The audio proved they were standing at the rear exit. He was trying to leave. He had seen the charity logo on his trust fund paperwork, realized something was fundamentally wrong, and attempted to walk out of the room. She was the one who intercepted him. She had slammed the heavy door shut, trapping him in the back hallway to prevent him from taking the documents or leaving the house before she could control the narrative. My pulse hammered a steady, relentless rhythm against my throat. I reached into the binder and pulled out her official police statement, running my finger down the paragraphs until I found the exact quotes she had attributed to him. I read the sentence. She claimed he had screamed at her right before she called the authorities. "You are stealing from me." Rowan had sworn on his life that he had never uttered those words. Initially, I assumed she had simply invented a generic aggressive phrase to make him sound volatile. But looking at it now through the lens of the financial ledgers and the backdoor acoustics, the phrase transformed into something far more dangerous. It was the final undeniable puzzle piece. If Rowan did not know about the trust fund addendum, and if he had not yet comprehended the missing money, he could not possibly accuse her of stealing. The only person in that house who knew a massive theft was actively occurring was Vanessa. When she cornered him by the mudroom door, her mind was racing with absolute panic. She assumed he had read the file. She assumed she was caught. When she gave her statement to the police, she did not write down what my son actually said. She unknowingly wrote down her own internal terror. She documented the exact accusation she believed he was going to make. She had projected her own guilt directly onto his permanent record. I looked at the clock on the bottom corner of my screen. It was 3 in the morning. The house was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. I closed the laptop and slowly snapped the heavy metal rings of the binder shut. I felt entirely awake. The exhaustion of the past month had completely burned away, leaving behind a sensation that was both razor-thin and incredibly hard, like a sheet of tempered glass. I walked down the dark hallway to my bedroom, knowing that I would not sleep. Tomorrow was not going to be a day from maternal tears in a courtroom. I was not going to stand before the judge and beg for mercy or tell a touching story about what a good boy my son truly was. Tomorrow was the day I walked into that courthouse and forced a beloved woman to completely perish, crushed under the absolute, unforgiving precision of her own lies. The heavy oak double doors of the Bryan County Courthouse swung shut with a muffled final thud, sealing us inside a room that smelled of floor polish and institutional dread. We took our seats at the defense table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a low, maddening frequency that seemed to vibrate directly into my teeth. Then Vanessa walked down the center aisle. She was a masterclass in calculated optics. She wore a pale dove-gray cardigan over a hickory blouse, her hair pinned back loosely, allowing a few deliberate strands to frame her face. But the absolute centerpiece of her performance was the thin flesh-cold bandage meticulously wrapped around her right wrist. It was a subtle, brilliant stroke of theater screaming victimhood without uttering a single word. She took her seat beside her high-priced attorney, folding her hands and lowering her eyes with the fragile grace of a martyr just trying to protect her fractured family. Her attorney, a sharp-suited man who spoke with the polished, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned storyteller, wasted zero time painting the canvas of the morning. He stood before the judge and wove a tight, digestible narrative. According to him, my son was a classic tragic case of teenage resentment. Rowan was framed as an entitled young man, deeply dissatisfied with his stepmother's gentle authority, quietly brooding over his father's money. The attorney claimed that on the night in question, when Vanessa simply tried to offer him some maternal guidance, Rowan's simmering rage boiled over into a terrifying, uncontrollable physical outburst. It was clean. It was simple. It was exactly the kind of story a conservative county judge hears a dozen times a week and instinctively believes. Then they called Dean to the witness stand. The man who swore to protect our child walked up the wooden steps looking entirely hollowed out. He had the sunken, bruised eyes of a man who had not slept in days, his shoulders drooping under an invisible weight. The opposing attorney asked him gently about the environment in his home leading up to the night of the arrest. Dean swallowed hard, his eyes darting anywhere but the defense table where his son sat. He did not outright lie and say he saw Rowan physically strike Vanessa, but he did the next worst thing. He offered a desperate, cowardly concession. He leaned into the microphone and muttered that the atmosphere in the house had been incredibly tense for the last several months. He claimed everyone was walking on eggshells. He thought he was remaining neutral, but he was actually handing the prosecution the exact psychological precedent they needed. He had just officially validated Vanessa's claim of a hostile living environment. Capitalizing on Dean's devastating passivity, the opposing attorney moved for the kill. He entered the handwritten diary into evidence, projecting the tear-stained pages onto the large screen. He followed it with a blown-up, head-of photograph of a faint yellowish bruise on Vanessa's upper arm, completely devoid of any medical context or timestamp. Finally, he read aloud the beautiful, forgetting social media post she had written asking the town to pray for her family, showcasing her boundless, long-suffering endurance. The effect on the courtroom was palpable. The heavy silence shifted. I could feel the collective gaze of the gallery pressing against the back of my neck. Even the court clerk looked at my son with a fleeting expression of disgust. The momentum was a tidal wave, and it was entirely crashing against us. June stood up. She did not perform. She simply walked to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and began to systematically dismantle the theater. She pulled up the dashboard camera video provided by Evelyn, letting the crisp audio of Vanessa's aggressive, cold-blooded threat echo through the silent courtroom. She followed the video immediately with the digital server logs from the network printer, opposed against the cloud creation dates of the word processing document titled Behavior Timeline. She methodically explained to the judge that the handwritten diary spanning 8 months had actually been typed, printed, and hand-copied over 2 frantic nights just prior to the request for the protective order. For a fraction of a second, the immaculate mask slipped, sitting at the plaintiff table, Vanessa's jaw locked tight, and her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped her pen. But she was a survivor of her own vanity, and she recovered with frightening speed. When the judge demanded an explanation, Vanessa stood up, her voice trembling with perfect manufactured panic. She claimed she was not forging anything. She tearfully insisted that her original notes had been hastily scribbled on random scraps of paper over the months, stained with her own terrified tears, and she had simply compiled and rewritten them into a fresh notebook so they would be neat and legible for the honorable court. She framed her forgery as an act of respectful compliance. Her attorney immediately sprang back to his feet, smoothly catching the pivot. He raised his hands, adopting a tone of exasperated common sense. He argued that even if his client had been clumsy in her recording, even if a traumatized woman had poorly consolidated her private fears, it did not magically erase the violence of the night in question. He pointed a rigid finger at the defense table. He declared that clumsy handwriting did not prove my son was innocent of the physical threat, That resulted in an emergency dispatch at 1:00 in the morning. A disorganized victim, he argued passionately, is still a victim of a crime. The chilling reality settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. This was the absolute, most dangerous crossroad of the entire war. The judge was leaning back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable. He could clearly see that Vanessa was deeply dishonest about her timeline and her paperwork. But the opposing lawyer was technically right about the core legal mechanic. Proving she was a liar about the diary did not automatically prove my son did not back her into a corner and threaten her life. The court could very easily throw out the diary, but still uphold the domestic violence charge and the protective order based solely on the emergency call and Dean's testimony about the tense household. The foundational pillar of her trap, the physical location, and the psychological motive of the argument itself remained entirely unbroken. Rowan stared down at his hands, his chest rising and falling in shallow, defeated breaths. He thought it was over. He thought the lie was simply too big, too heavily armored by her reputation and his father's cowardice to ever fully pierce. June walked slowly back to our table. She did not sit down. She gathered her legal pads, aligning the edges perfectly. Then she turned her head and looked down at me. It was a microscopic, almost imperceptible glance, lasting no more than a single second. It was the signal. The defensive perimeter was fully exhausted, and the enemy was standing exactly where we needed them to be. June turned back to face the front of the room. She squared her shoulders, her voice ringing out crisp and devoid of any hesitation, cutting through the stifling tension of the Bryan County courthouse. She said, "Your Honor, the mother would like to testify regarding the sequence and knowledge timeline." The rustling of papers stopped. The low murmurs in the gallery instantly died. Every single head in the courtroom turned simultaneously to look at me. The judge lowered his reading glasses, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through his stoic demeanor. Even Vanessa shifted in her seat, a tiny jagged crack of uncertainty finally appearing in her wide, beautiful eyes. I stood up from my wooden chair, feeling the cool, solid weight of the heavy binder in my hands. The entire room was waiting for me, and for the very first time since the phone call at 1:12 in the morning, I was ready to speak. I walked to the wooden witness stand. The bailiff asked me to raise my right hand and swear to tell the truth. I did so with a perfectly steady hand. When I took my seat, I did not cry. I did not launch into a passionate theatrical monologue about the profound bond between a mother and her child. Juries and judges are entirely immune to tears. They see them every single day. I simply looked up at the judge, my voice carrying the calm, sterile authority of a woman who had spent decades auditing catastrophic failures, and asked for permission to clarify 3 specific points regarding the night of the arrest. I told the court I wanted to discuss the geography of the house, the acoustics of the altercation, and the exact chronological timeline of human knowledge. June approached the clerk and submitted the enhanced audio file we had extracted from my son's cellular phone. The judge allowed it to be played. Stripped of the chaotic background noise, the heavy violent clash of solid metal striking metal echoed clearly through the silent courtroom. I then directed the court to look at the sworn affidavit Vanessa had provided to the responding officers. In her official statement, she claimed she was backed into a corner in the formal living room, a space located at the extreme front of the sprawling property, surrounded by soft carpets and draped windows. I explained that the unmistakable metallic sound capture on the recording belonged to the heavy strike plate of the rear mudroom door. That specific door was located entirely at the opposite end of the residence, directly adjacent to Dean's private study. The physical reality of the confrontation was completely inverted. My son was not aggressively advancing on his stepmother in the family living area. He was actively attempting to flee the room containing the financial trust documents, and she had physically blocked his only exit, violently slamming the heavy door shut to trap him in the hallway. The judge frowned, his pen hovering over his legal pad as the structural integrity of the prosecution's case began to crack, but the geography was only the foundation. I moved to the second point. I'd asked the court to examine the exact quote Vanessa had attributed to my son in the police report. She had sworn under penalty of perjury that right before she dialed the emergency dispatch, Rowan had screamed, "You are stealing from me." I looked directly across the room at Vanessa. Her hands were gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. I turned back to the judge and stated that it was a chronological impossibility for my son to make that accusation. Prior to that exact night, Rowan had absolutely zero knowledge of the trust fund modifications. He had never been shown a single bank statement. He had no idea the money was missing. Therefore, he could not possibly accuse her of a highly specific financial crime he had not yet comprehended. Right on cue, June stepped forward. She handed the court clerk the massive stack of discovery documents we had compiled. She submitted the recalled email log showing the hidden trust revisions. She submitted the digital metadata report proving unequivocally that the predatory legal addendum had been authored entirely on Vanessa's personal laptop. Finally, she submitted the bank ledgers Marable had verified, highlighting the steady, relentless bleed of thousands of dollars transferred straight from my son's education reserve directly into the operating accounts of the Harbor Light Charity Organization. The motive of the entire night shifted in an instant. This was not a fragile stepmother terrified of being physically attacked by an angry teenager. This was a panicked, desperate embezzler who realized a witness had just walked into the wrong room and seen the wrong documents. She needed him arrested and discredited before he could ever tell anyone what he had discovered. I leaned closer to the microphone. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. I delivered the final fatal blow with absolute freezing clarity. She did not write what Rowan said. She wrote what she feared he knew. A collective sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery behind me at the plaintiff table. The immaculate facade finally completely shattered. Vanessa slumped back in her chair, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, the color draining entirely from her face. Her high-priced attorney stared at the financial ledgers, realizing he had been completely blinded by his own client. But the most profound destruction happened to Dean. My ex-husband stood up from his chair, his face a mask of absolute horror. He ignored the courtroom decorum and begged the judge to project the digital signature timestamp of the trust addendum onto the large screen. The clerk complied. Dean stared at the glowing numbers. He realized the depth of his betrayal. His signature had not been forged from scratch. He had been carefully managed. Vanessa had given him a benign standard document to read, and then she had digitally attached his authorized signature to a completely different final version containing the clauses that handed her total control of the money. He had blindly handed her the knife she used to stab his own son. Dean sank back down, burying his face in his trembling hands, completely broken. The judge did not need to deliberate. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. He struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp crack. He immediately denied the permanent protective order with prejudice. He formally recommended to the district attorney that the criminal charges against my son be dropped and expuned from the record that very afternoon. Furthermore, he announced he was transferring the entire file regarding the trust fund modifications and the charity ledgers to the State Investigative Bureau for a full inquiry into civil fraud, grand larceny, and perjury. The ultimate revenge did not come from me screaming at her or calling her names. It arrived in absolute silence. Sitting in the third row of the gallery was the president of the Harbor Light Board of Directors. He had come to the courthouse to support the beloved charitable woman of Cedar Hollow. As the judge finished his ruling, the older man slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, looked down at Vanessa with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, and walked out of the heavy double doors without looking back. Vanessa watched him leave, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her entire social empire, her pristine reputation, and her entire identity in this town had just been reduced to ash. We walked out into the bright, echoing hallway of the courthouse. The heavy weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks was finally gone. Dean was waiting near the exit. He looked like a hollow shell of a human being. He took a hesitant step toward Rowan, tears streaming down his face. He held out his hand and offered a pathetic, desperate apology, swearing he did not know the extent of what she was doing. Rowan did not raise his voice. He did not cry. He looked at his father with eyes that held a maturity and a coldness born of profound trauma. He kept his hands in his pockets, stepped back, and delivered a short, painful sentence that would haunt Dean for the rest of his life. "You did not lose me in one night." Dean flinched as if he had been physically struck. He understood instantly. This was not about a single argument or a single bad decision. It was the absolute verdict on months of willful ignorance, cowardice, and turning a blind eye to his sons, suffering just to keep the peace in his own house. We drove back to our quiet home. The afternoon sun was shining brightly through the living room windows. I walked into the dining room, picked up the heavy color-coded binder, and walked over to the tall wooden bookshelf. I slid it into an empty space between two heavy dictionaries. It was not a trophy to be paraded around. It was a silent, permanent monument to a terrifying truth. There are moments in this world when a mother cannot protect her child by crying, begging, or screaming into the void. Sometimes the only way to win is to suppress the panic, build an impenetrable fortress of facts, and wait patiently for the absolute perfect moment to speak. And when you finally do, the lie simply has nowhere left to stand. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So, please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Like the video and support us even more by hitting the like button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.